Hi YouTube, it's Kia of Kia Comments, and I'm back with another video. Today I'm doing a book review of the novel The Fair Fight by Anna Freeman. This book is set in 18th century Bristol, and we follow three protagonists as they wend their way through the underground fighting world of female and male boxing, and as they wend their way through the lives of the gentry during that period. The three protagonists come from varying background. There's Ruth, who was born in a brothel, who is from the lower socioeconomic end of Bristol, and there's George and Charlotte, who are both born into gentry, but Charlotte is female gentry, and during that time females had no rights, and George is the last of four boys, I think, which means that he has no real inheritance coming to him. As our three narrators each tell their story, we see how their lives intertwine together, and the plot of this narrative really gains depth and becomes most intriguing. I tend to be one given to character and place in a novel, and I find that once I've attached myself to a character or I've been grounded in a physical place, I will go anywhere that the author of a novel takes me. However, I found that in this novel, Anna Freeman does not sacrifice anything. The plot is wonderfully rendered, the characters have depth and layers, and the place is really visceral. So going more in depth into characters, Ruth kicks off the narration of the novel. We start when Ruth is about 8 or 9, maybe even 10, and she discusses what it's like to be born in a brothel. She talks about the situation and condition that her and her older sister Dora are in. They are basically housekeepers in the brothel to which they were born and which their mother runs. They do little errands for the men who come to see the women in the brothel. They clean the brothel, they clean the kitchen, and for the most part, the tone as the novel begins, though matter of fact, is a pretty upbeat one. Soon we see Dora, the older sister of Ruth, who plays a part in the novel as well, come into her own in terms of beauty, and she starts to make money, which makes Ruth jealous of Dora. And one day when Dora is being chosen by a man to go and earn her pay, Ruth gets jealous and she and Dora have a fight. The gentleman who is going to sleep with Dora and who witnesses the fight between Ruth and her sister Dora sees something in Ruth and basically goes to Ruth's mother and procures her as a fighter for him. This gentleman, Mr. Dreyer, then has his hands on Dora, as she is his prostitute, and on Ruth, who narrates the first part of the novel as she becomes his fighter. Moving from Ruth's narration, which introduces us to Ruth, as well as Ruth's sisters Dora and Mr. Dryden, we hear from George. George is the last son. He is gentry, but as the last son, he will gain no inheritance. And he is sent to boarding school because his brothers bully him, but more importantly, so that he can get an education, which will procure him a job as a lawyer or maybe as a priest, which is what usual gentry who was not firstborn, that was their usual profession. And so he is in boarding school. Typical to boarding schools, George does not room alone. He has a roommate, Percy, who is also not a firstborn son, and Percy and George develop a very close relationship. They are best friends and eventually become more intimate. But for reasons that are disclosed in the novel, Percy has to leave the school and George gets another roommate who happens to be Mr. Dryden, the Mr. Dryden who is in a relationship with the prostitute Dora and who, for lack of a better term, somewhat owns Ruth, the female prize fighter. The final narrator that readers are introduced to in the novel is Charlotte. Charlotte is female and she is upper class. She is the sister of Percy, who was George Bowden's roommate at boarding school. And we see a very unique perspective of somebody who comes from a life of privilege, but as a woman who also suffers during that time because the privilege only extends to the match she will make in a privileged male as a husband. From Charlotte's perspective, readers also get to see a unique picture of Percy, George Bowden, and Mr. Dryden, all three males who went to the same boarding school and have become friends because George Bowden was the roommate of Percy, who is his best friend and lover, and was the roommate of Mr. Dryden, who is his close friend and sometimes business partner. Charlotte, the sister of Percy, sees these men and all of the things that they do. The way that they speak around her, the way that they act around her is very dismissive, and it's almost as though she is not there. And because they speak and act as though Charlotte is not there, the perspective of the men that we get through her eyes is pretty unflinching and pretty uncompromising and draws very deep characters of the men and demonstrates. There's one more character that I have not mentioned in the novel, and that is Tom. Tom shows up usually through Ruth's narrative, and he ultimately becomes her husband. And when Ruth has something drastic happen to her, Tom too becomes kind of an indentured slave to Mr. Dryden and fights for Mr. Dryden. So Charlotte and George, readers get this wonderful, multifaceted, class-rendered novel. We see the peripheral characters, Percy, Tom, Dora, and how they play out along with the main protagonists in the novel. We see Bristol in a very wonderful way, which is not to say that Bristol itself always is pictured or portrayed as wonderful in the novel. And we get the last thing that I think is most important in a novel, some beautifully rendered language. Anna Freeman does a really good job in depicting the different types of language used by the different classes of individuals throughout the novel. It's interesting to see how Ruth, who is born in a brothel and who is a fighter and who is basically from the streets, speaks in comparison to Charlotte, who is an upper class female, versus how Charlotte and Ruth speak against Mr. George Bowden, who is an upper class male. There are some wonderful cliches in there that I use today that I didn't necessarily know the origins from, and so they took on meaning linguistically. For example, Ruth talks about stepping up to scratch, which is basically the line that's drawn when two fighters face each other. I didn't know that up to scratch, which is a term I use all the time to basically say that I'm up for the challenge, derived from this fighter language. It was really wonderful. Ruth also discusses her husband and says how he is as fine as 5 pence, which I also say it's a term that I got from my mother, which is a term that my grandmother used, which we usually use to describe something of beauty in our family, but I never really realized the actual literal meaning, fine as 5 pence, which was a significant amount of money to a certain person back in the day in the United Kingdom. So the language too really is rendered beautifully in this novel. I highly recommend this novel. I found it enjoyable. I would give it 4.5 to 5 out of 5 stars. Characterization was wonderfully done. Place was rendered in a good way. This novel wasn't too sentimental, and the use of language and the various different perspectives made this novel a rollicking ride. And I am still contemplating it, even though I finished it about a week and a half ago, and I think I will still, well, contemplate it in the days to come. So that's all. That's my review. Please keep reading, keep writing, keep reviewing, rate, comment, and subscribe.